Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. One of the defining features of what we like to call the West is that our picture, our story about the self, is individualistic in the sense of being separated off from each other and the rest of the world. And there are a lot of complex reasons why that has been the case. There's also complex reasons why in the United States, where I'm broadcasting from, that has pushed even farther into a situation of hyper-individuality where it's all about individual rights, as though as though you could be on a lifeboat with other people and kick the bottom out of it because it's your right to control the space on which you stand, right? Ludicrous. Nevertheless, it's a bias that's built into Western culture. And as a result, the mainstream psychology and psychiatry are primarily about individuals. There are things like social psychology, but the entire emphasis in psychology, the entire focus, is almost exclusively on the boundaried individual. Whether it's what goes on inside us or a more behavioral approach. And as a sidebar, isn't it odd that so many psychology programs and psychology research departments got renamed behavioral? I mean, it should have been obvious from the very start that two people can have the same behavior and it means completely different things. Odd. How much can we really learn from just studying behavior without understanding the story of the person who's doing the behaving? In any case, there we are with our separate self. And I want to highlight one discovery from Carl Jung's work that did so much to break us out of that separate sense of selfhood. And it started when he was on a train trip. And I've heard different versions of what happened to him. It looks like he was reading and got in kind of a sleepy state of mind. Whatever it was, he was in an altered state. And he had a kind of vision, a kind of sleepy vision of water sweeping over Europe. Most of Europe, not Switzerland. And so Jung, being a trained psychiatrist, at that time, I think he was 39, something like that. He recognized this as a danger signal and was afraid that he had a psychosis on the way. So it disturbed him pretty much. And then on the train trip back home, something similar happened to him, but this time the water wasn't water, it was blood. So Jung embarked on an extensive self-analysis. He also talked to people who were close to him about what his experiences were. And on the obvious principle that you shouldn't be analyzing and treating other people unless you've gone through some version of that yourself. Today we require some kind of training, therapy, or analysis. And one of the things that came up during that time was that Jung began to realize that there might be more to the dream images than could be accounted for just by himself. Now, this is a bias that we still have. So when we work with dreams, oftentimes you'll hear certain schools of dream work saying things like every symbol in the dream belongs to the individual, or every symbol in the dream is about some aspect of your personality or your life or what have you. And again, it's that individualistic emphasis. It's a bias. It's also true a lot of the time. There are many dreams, perhaps even the majority of them, where the different dream symbols stand for different aspects of who you are. And so you use free association, which Freud gave us, noticing what first comes to mind when you hold each of the symbols in your imagination, for instance, to help you decode what they are, or you take them into what Jung called active imagination, and you sit with them until more sides of what they mean reveal themselves. And you might do a little homework on them. Oftentimes the symbols are not fixed. They're usually not fixed. So dream books can be helpful to a certain point if you pick one up or you look at it online and it says, a car means being driven, let's say. Um, you have to go by how your body receives that, how your emotions receive it. If it's this big aha, then it probably fits. Otherwise, just move on to the next interpretation of whatever that means. So, in all of this, we're trying to understand what the symbols are telling us. So, about a year after Jung had his two visionary experiences, the First World War broke out. And the outbreak of the war worked like a dream interpretation that fits, in the sense that when Jung heard about it, of course he was horrified. Who wouldn't be? This was the outbreak of the First World War. Not called that then, but called that later by historians. But he also felt relieved because he realized that his visionary experiences and warlike images that also appeared in his dreams were all forecasting the oncoming war. And at one point, I don't remember if it's in his red book or his black books or both, he says, I felt the war coming because it broke out in me. And for those who don't know, the black books were Jung's journals. So he wrote in them when he was doing active imagination. And the red book is an excerpt from the black books. It's a 4-year chunk of the 19-year journey that the black books go into. So the red book is an excerpt, and it includes Jung's art, which is superb, and his interpretations as well. So this was a monumental discovery. It showed Jung that there are things we dream that don't just belong to us. They move us, they stir us, they're in our psyche, to use that word for conscious and unconscious taken together. They're in our consciousness, but they don't originate there. And so here is where American psychology tends to part ways with all of this and say, well, we don't go in for metaphysics and this is all mystical nonsense and so on and so forth. It's actually not. Psychoanalysis has for decades now given us pretty sharp glimpses of the interactive field in therapy or analysis. And the interactive field is the psychological web of interactions that we participate when we're in the therapy space or the space of psychoanalysis. It's been well studied. It's been studied by psychotherapists of other disciplines too, including the family systems that I was trained in and practiced on and off for 9 years. And so it's actually fairly well established that there is a sort of web or field of presences that we enter into with each other. And this too puts a check on the idea that our psyche is only ours, that it only belongs to us, and that it's somehow separate from the world. Notice how when you assume it's separate, then you have to invent all this conceptual machinery to explain how the world gets into us, how relationships get into us, and how we get into other people. But if you simply assume from the start that interconnection is the root reality of consciousness, you don't have to put in all those Ptolemaic epicycles, all that extra baggage, that extra conceptual baggage. And interestingly, this is the default in many non-Western cultures, past and present. The idea that what we would in the West call the psychological field or the interactive field always exists. We're always in it with other people and with the rest of the world as well. And that's the base reality, the given reality. So Jung came into this discovery after himself being very individually oriented, and he kept to that to some extent. So, for instance, he discouraged using Jungian psychology in groups, which was a mistake. There's been many Jungian practitioners who have done splendid group work of many different kinds. So that was his bias. Nevertheless, his experiences in active imagination and with dream work showed him that this wall between our inner life and the outer, which we would now philosophically consider a form of dualism, is actually an illusion. It doesn't mean that there's no boundary. That would be psychosis. At least certain forms of it would be psychosis. When you can't distinguish yourself from other people, for instance. Um, it also lines up with something that in family systems we refer to as emotional enmeshment. Being over concerned about somebody else to the point where you're just triggered by them constantly, you resonate to them emotionally constantly, and so on. Bad boundaries. So Jung went on from that to analyze what he estimated to be 81,000 dreams of his patients, as they called them back then. And of course, kept on with his own dream work. And again, in all the dreams that Jung gives us throughout his works, collected letters, everything, you can see examples of dreams that point to things happening in the world that the dreamer wasn't consciously aware of. Jung has sometimes referred to this as the collective unconscious, and again, when you say that term, there's the usual responses of, oh, it's mystical nonsense and all that. But there are fairly simple ways of understanding it. It's a complex observation that goes very deep. But for those of us who are skeptical reductionists, one way of holding it is that we're simply talking about the psychological field that we all share. That would be one layer of it anyway. So if we're using the term in that sense, what we might call it is collective unconsciousness, as opposed to being conscious of all of our interactions with other people, which would probably be impossible because so much goes on under the surface, particularly non-verbally. Even outside of Jung's work, there are many accounts of people dreaming things before they happened. People dreaming things that were currently happening that they knew nothing about. And the interactive field that this takes place in doesn't seem to have a definable boundary. We can't say here's where it starts and here's where somebody else's stops and all that. So it's something that I don't know if it would ever be measured or not. But in any case, those of us who work in this arena see it all the time and experience it ourselves. Even to the point where when I teach classes on interpreting dreams and people say, I don't dream, I ask them to keep an eye on the dreams of their kids, if they have any, loved ones, friends, because we dream each other's dreams. And this is very common, actually. It's weird that it's not talked about publicly more. And there are ways of knowing if it's your dream or somebody else's. But that too is a reflection of the field, collective unconsciousness. You also see it a lot when you do process groups, experiential groups, especially when dream work is involved. There's when I do this in class, for instance, when I teach graduate students, there's often one person in the group who's kind of the group dreamer. And so in exercises, sometimes this person will speak first, and right at the beginning of the class sometimes, the images that they speak will resonate with other class members who say, oh, I had a dream about that the other day, or I dreamed about that 2 weeks ago. So this is something that's actually fairly common. But because it doesn't fit our hyper-individualistic worldview, you don't hear about it much in the public discourse. That's the thing about worldviews. They work like filters. And so anytime there's something that is against what the story, the worldview story tells, it gets excluded from consciousness. And that's as true as collectives, with groups, as much as it is with individuals. There are collective repressions out of consciousness. And you can see that today with the outstanding example of climate chaos, which is already happening. It's not in the future anymore. And yet there are large sectors of the public who are in complete denial of it. So that's a form of collective unconsciousness right there. Collective repression. So, to return to Jung and his dreams, he realized that in some sense we're dreaming together, we're dreaming for each other, we're dreaming with the world and with the happenings of the world. And when big world events show up or bits of nature show up in people's dreams, I often refer to them in my own work as world dreams because the dreams are more about what's happening out there than they are about the dreamer. Sometimes they interlock with something going on in the dreamer, and sometimes maybe not. So, and our symptoms can do that too. So, I lived through the Northridge earthquake. I was a few miles from the epicenter. It was really a heck of a blast and really shook things up, destroyed most of the things in my apartment. And throughout the San Fernando Valley, there were houses pushed off their foundations. It was that powerful a quake. And according to the news, there were people who couldn't live inside a structure for months afterward. And the weather was pretty warm, as it often is in Southern California, so people were camping out. But I wished that there had been some kind of a study done to see if these people were also suffering from some kind of an inner earthquake as well. If the emotional foundations of their life were in some sort of transition, like they had just gone through a big family event, a death in the family or some other rearrangement of the family structure, or if they were changing jobs or just about to, or things like that. Because the symbolism between the outer quake and the inner seems to have been so acute for some people that they just couldn't go back inside. And so that happens sometimes. And it also happens in dreams. There may be an inner Titanic going on, and then the outer one sinks, for instance. Some loss or some hubris happening, whatever it is. So there often are overlaps. And that's the tricky thing about this. When we see in our dreams and also in our emotional reactions that we are actually carrying something of what's happening in the collective, then at that point it becomes hard to tell what's ours and what's not. And so it's important to try to get a sense of how much. Not a precise one, but it's important because when we're resonating with collective events, sometimes we're taking too much on ourselves by how we interpret that. So, for instance, somebody might go through a week of terrible anxiety, and then maybe there's a flood in their state or in their region, or maybe they're having constant violent nightmares for a week, and then there's a political coup that's violent in their country. And so if you don't have this view that Jung gave us, that there are some aspects to the psyche that live outside of us, then you might misinterpret all that anxiety or those nightmares as belonging just to you. And, I should get treatment for this or what have you, And maybe you should, but the problem is that you're interpreting too much inwardly. You're taking on too much with your interpretation. So I don't know that we can, except by numbing ourselves in some harmful ways, I don't know that we can untangle ourselves from what's happening outside. But when we know that some of it is external, it does bring a sense of relief. And then we can turn to our anxiety or our symptoms or our nightmares or our dreams and say, okay, some of this is actually not psychopathology. It's not just my conflict, my sufferings, my neurosis, whatever, but it's a form of bearing witness. My symptoms, my conflicts, my anxieties are bearing witness to something important that's happening in the world. And that's a very different way of holding the experience. And so while it doesn't necessarily mean that we're mystics or prophets, what it can mean, what it probably means, is that we're sensitive. That there's a lot going on outside of us, and a very inwardly felt part of our psyche knows exactly what's going on. And the part of us that's registering all this is letting us know that we are not crazy, that we are not necessarily neurotic, but that we are at some deep level responsive. Thank you.